So I'm still in Crisp's edited work of Griffin on human rights, and I'm now in chapter 3 with David Reidy's When the Good Alone Isn't Good Enough. So this one here is saying that, again, Griffin's got some great ideas and a good approach and all that, but he kind of cheats a little bit on his approach. And Reidy points this out in a couple of places throughout the article. And that, this good alone, right? What does he mean by that? But nonetheless, his main point is that Griffin seems to have this very isolated notion of the self and the good and wants to drive everything from that. And that's just simply too abstract. So Tsoulis also makes this criticism that Griffin's approach is too abstract. Despite Griffin's claim that he wants to do this bottom-up approach, it still is too abstract. So let's have a little bit of a look here. So Reidy says that his critique of Griffin is based on 3 sources. And we've seen this one before: insufficient development of the human right concept, right? So again, we've seen other authors criticize Griffin that this is too abstract. You haven't really embedded or related the notion of a human right to other moral rights, to ethics in general. You haven't theorized the whole story. And so that leaves Griffin, vulnerable to charges of, well, you're smuggling in some things in order to make your theory work. You might be cheating on your methodology, or at least you're not disclosing all the assumptions that you make. And when you make them, they're not really clear. So insufficient development of that. So again, on a related note, fails to account for the place of human rights in this deontic domain of the right. What does it mean to be, not the right isn't just correct, and it's not a political thing, but a moral domain. Here's another one that Griffin uses, again, relating to his title, that this relationship, the key relationship he uses is the person and good, a person's relation to this projection as the result of having normative agency, this construction and projection of a good, and then the pursuit of that good. That's too abstract of a notion, right? It's a very isolated, atomistic view of society, right? Just all little selves running around creating and following and pursuing and articulating goods and going after it. So he says, okay, Griffin prioritizes the good. He starts with the notion of a good, and then looks at deriving the right. So we've got a teleological view using Rawls's famous way of talking of, deontic theories and teleological theories that you can find in his book, A Theory of Justice, in I think pages 22 to 27, something like that. And so lots of scholars have picked up on that distinction. So we've got a teleological theory, but it's not simply a consequentialist theory as opposed to a deontological one. It's a subtler theory than that, Reidy says about Griffin's view, which is fine. But then he says Griffin kind of begs a question here. And remember, begging a question doesn't mean raising. It means presupposing, something that should have been proved. You just presuppose it. There's the question, though. What's the relationship between rights and social recognition? Is there a right? Can you have rights in the complete absence of society? Does it make sense to talk about that? And if you say no, so what's the role of social recognition in rights? How does this work? Griffin doesn't really answer that. According to Reidy, all Griffin does is just say, well, rights are just valid moral claims. And again, doesn't really unpack how all this works. He just says they're valid moral claims, and in that sense, Griffin's view of is in this unclear one. Full stop. Just rights are valid moral claims. But is he right about this? Right, in this assertion, right? So put a little question mark, as Reidy said. Is he right about this assertion? We could question it. There's a long debate about the relationship between rights and social recognition. Does a right necessarily involve some kind of appeal to social recognition or an institutional embodiment? What's the role of institutions? When we talk about rights, do institutions play a role? And everyone would agree, probably, Reidy says that it's, yeah, okay, fine. There's going to be some individualistic aspects of it, of rights, or maybe some very just theoretical abstract notion. But there's also they're embedded, right, in society and institutions. So you can't really just simply say that there's nothing to do with them, even with this social context or social recognition, even if you don't want to assert that it's all about social stuff, that Griffin goes far too much to the abstract, and some people go the other way, that it makes no sense to talk about rights except completely embedded in a social situation. Reidy's not making any of those claims. He's saying that more or less that either of those are a little too far in either direction. But he's saying that Griffin just really tends to ignore this. And that also relates to just, uses person good as a fundamental relation, but neglects person to other person, like interpersonal relations, and person's relations to institutions. So the social context is neglected by Griffin and just looks at the person, very individualistically. Again, sort of like an Enlightenment project, just the individual. And again, Griffin says he's trying to flesh that Enlightenment project out. So is it methodologically consistent? Is Griffin kind of cheating if he says he wants to use a bottom-up approach and flesh this all out? Is he kind of cheating on his own methodology if he's claiming to do this bottom-up approach, but he's actually doing kind of arguably, according to Reidy, a kind of a narrow top-down, self-centered approach? And keeping with that idea, Griffin, when you think of normative agency, and I just abbreviate it as NA, normative agency, how do we think about that? Well, Reidy says that Griffin is saying that the normative agency is really a kind of power that the self has, right? And what is this power? It's this ability, this capacity to construct, follow, pursue, articulate, rationalize, reason out, all these things to come up with an idea of good, right? So this important thing of good as the starting point, that the self can come up with this and then pursue it. And Reidy says this is really an isolated notion of self, very different than, let's say, someone like Rawls, who talks about the self as being a very social self. So this is an independent little self, independent. Maybe relations there might be some social aspects, but in the end, the whole notion of the self, according to Griffin, is really an independent one. So Griffin is different from Rawls, according to Reidy, on the core of the self. Rawls is more social, as I said. So Griffin's self, his notion of the self, it constitutes its good first. And then the right will be objective truths that are responsive to that that particular good. So moral rights and claims then follow from the relation of the self to its good and not the relations of the self to other selves or institutions. And so again, he's begged the question, what roles? And the answer is really, what roles do institutions and other selves play in this good and these and all this with rights? And the answer is none. He's kind of begged this question. He's just sort of sloughed it off. And but it's not grounded in argument. It's just grounded in the presupposition of the nature of the self in the first place. And so, but yet on the other hand, he's saying that this is not all fleshed out, and I'm going to flesh it out. So, is there some conflict, some tension in between what Griffin's actually doing and what he claims to be doing in terms of his methodology? All right. So, so this whole thing, this basic concern that Reidy has is that by bringing in the good and a particular understanding of the self right at the beginning, some key philosophical questions are being begged. And so this good alone is just not enough because it's ignoring other things. So hence when the good alone isn't good enough, it doesn't mean that the good alone, that notions of the good are irrelevant or unimportant. It's just not sufficient. So again, we see this constant criticism of Griffin, that, there's good ideas here, but it seems to be an insufficiently done project. And so he thinks that this highly abstract appeal that Griffin, it's not going to really make or do little. It's going to do little to make the notion of human rights more determinate. It's still unclear, according to Reidy, what the relationship is between human rights and the general good of life. Now, there's lots of criticisms that that Reidy has of Griffin's work. So you can have a look through the paper and look at a number of them. One concern, I'll just look at one of these concerns, is that that normative agency, Griffin says, is acquired in stages. We don't all have it. And if it's acquired in stages, you would think then that if that's correlated with rights or human rights, that they would too have some sort of scaling, right? Graduated or scaling acquired in stages like human rights. And Griffin, no, he seems to say, well, it's acquired, the normative agency is acquired, but maybe there's a kind of threshold that if you go beyond it in terms of your normal agency, you don't get any more human rights. It's just you hit the threshold and get that. Well, why does it work that way? So again, what's the reason for that? Is it just intuitive? You like it, or it just appeals? He thinks that why not have some kind of scaled version of this? Why do you reject it? Are you kind of, are you cheating a little bit on your methodology again? But it's not really explained. So maybe it's consistent, maybe not. Griffin doesn't, according to Reidy, give us enough of an explanation. And the rest of the paper, you can have a look at it. It goes through all kinds of issues that he thinks are problematic for Griffin. Not that it's Griffin's project is a failure in any words. No, that's not what he's saying. But he's saying there are a number of problems, and he kind of expresses a frustration that Griffin's not really. Again, echoing some of our previous critics, Griffin's not really articulating enough to see why he holds the positions that he does. And so the Griffin's work kind of falls short in terms of a lack of clarity, and it leads to frustration amongst our critics of Griffin. All right, that's it for When the Good Alone Isn't Good Enough by Reidy. Again, very interesting paper, much more going on than what I've said here, but I think I've given you the gist of it. So happy reading, and we'll see you next video.